Here's what's coming up on episode 83 of the Big Seance podcast. Roberta Grimes.
The Gospels are genuine. Jesus tells us things in the Gospels about God, reality, death, the afterlife, and the meaning and purpose of our lives that we could not have verified in any manner until the early 20th century. It's incredible and amazing and beautiful, and it was the most astonishing and wonderful moment of my life. And everything I've done since then has been to try to help people understand that Jesus is not a religious figure. Jesus came to us from God as our teacher, and it's time we listen to him. But because of our human nature, because of the fact that we forget who we are while we're here, this limited little shell, people will hold grudges, will be angry, and all of those negative feelings get in the way of love. You are an eternal being. You never started, you never ended. Eternal, not immortal, but eternal. Christianity is based in fear of a judgmental and angry God. There is no such thing. The genuine God is nothing but perfect love. People have to know that. And once they know that, really the whole world changes.
Welcome to the Big Seance podcast. I'm Patrick Keller of BigSeance.com, and this is a place for an open discussion on all things paranormal, but specifically topics like ghosts and hauntings, paranormal research, spirit communication, psychics and mediums, and life after death. So basically, anything that pops up in my paranormal world. The candles are already lit, so you might as well come on in and join the seance.
Hey you, it's my favorite paranerd. Listen, I'm not going to chat long here before the show today. I just want to quickly say 3 things. 1, I want to thank Please Go Away for the awesome iTunes review this week. 2, if you haven't joined already, I want to invite you to join the private Facebook group for all paranerds, and it's called the Big Seance Parlor. Send me a request, and as long as you're not a murderer or one of my students, I'll let you walk right on in for some tea. And number 3 is this. Please, please, please make sure you are subscribed to the show in iTunes, your podcast app of choice, or whatever service you use for your podcasts, whether it be something like iHeart or TuneIn. And if I can be honest here, being subscribed in iTunes or the iPhone podcast app is one of the best ways for you to help us grow and promote the show. So share with all your paranerd friends and get everyone subscribed. You rock. So that's it. We're going to change it up a little this week. First, here's Tim Prossel and another great Spectral edition. Then I'll be right here waiting to pour the tea for you and our guest, Roberta Grimes.
Welcome to Spectral Edition. I'm Tim Prossel. I have many ghost reports about haunted houses, but I have one here that I think is particularly interesting because it captures a moment in history. The haunted house is a log cabin in ruins. In a strange way, it paints a picture of that moment when the pioneer days were vanishing. The report appeared in the St. Paul Daily Globe on March 25th of 1885. The headline reads, "The House is Haunted, an extraordinary ghost sensation near a Hoosier hamlet," special to the Globe. Indianapolis, Indiana, March 24th. The people living in the neighborhood of Castleton, a small village 13 miles from Indianapolis, are greatly excited over a most extraordinary ghost sensation. Several hundred persons from the surrounding country have been crowded around the haunted spot since last Friday. There is an old log house on the farm of a man named Mart Garrison, which was built half a century ago and has been uninhabited for several years. Last week, Mr. Garrison began tearing the old structure down and hauling away the timber. Between sundown and dark on the evening of the first day's work, while loading his wagon, he says he became conscious of a peculiar feeling which made his hair stand erect with horror. And as he turned, he claims he saw 3 figures, 2 of them quite large, flitting around the ruins. He did not stop to investigate, but abandoned his work and fled for home when he related his experience to his wife and was advised to let the old structure alone. He talked about the strange apparition, and then it leaked out that an old citizen living near had often seen unearthly figures, and so had his family, and he had heard cries and moans like those of a woman in distress, but he feared to speak of it for fear the people would call him childish and superstitious. Another neighbor testified in much the same strain, and several persons investigated, but were unable to explain the character of the phenomena. They saw shadowy figures indistinctly resembling 2 adults and a child, and so did perhaps a half-score of others able to muster courage enough to visit the old ruins. Yesterday the farm was literally overrun with people, and reports reached the city that they found a grave in the cellar, which they proceeded to open, but were stopped in their work by a lady interested in the property. Hundreds of people have visited the haunted house, and there is great excitement over it in the neighborhood. It's interesting that the woman who's considering buying the property prevented them from opening the grave. You would think that she would want to know what was down there, but there you go. You've been listening to Spectral Edition. I'm Tim Prossel. I have close to 300 of these ghost reports, and I post one each Wednesday on my website, The Merry Ghost Hunter. I also have previously released audio versions of Spectral Edition there. The name again, The Merry Ghost Hunter, MERRY Ghost Hunter. I hope you stop by.
You're listening to the Big Seance podcast with Patrick Keller. Look for us on iTunes and be sure to check out bigseance.com for more discussion.
Roberta Grimes is a business attorney who has spent decades studying nearly 200 years of abundant and consistent communications from the dead, quantum mechanics, and the nature of consciousness, and she shares what she's learned about what actually is going on in an enjoyable and easily understood trilogy: The Fun of Dying, The Fun of Staying in Touch, and The Fun of Growing Forever. Other books include Liberating Jesus, Flying High in Spirit, and My Thomas. Roberta has been a guest on hundreds of radio programs. She hosts her own live show called Seek Reality on the BBM Global Network, and podcasts of previous Seek Reality shows are available for free on webtalkradio.net and on iTunes. Her website is robertagrimes.com. I hope you are ready for this lady's energy. Pour the tea. Okay, paranerds, I'm excited for today because our guest is here in the parlor because of you, actually. Several of you in the last year have contacted me telling me about this wonderful author and researcher and podcast host named Roberta Grimes. And I want to specifically credit Mac Connor and Jill Whitley because they were the first to draw my attention to Roberta and her work. And since then, I've read her very popular book, The Fun of Dying, and I'm now a regular listener of her live show, which is also a podcast. I listen to the podcast version, called Seek Reality. Welcome, Roberta.
I'm so glad to be with you. We're going to have so much fun with this.
I know. I've been so excited all morning. I even woke up about an hour early this morning with questions going in my head. Oh my gosh, I can ask her this. I can ask her this.
I'm here. Whatever you'd like to know, I'm happy to try to help you get the answers.
Oh, good. You're wonderful. Well, I almost just don't know where to start with you. You are someone who I wish I would have had on the show a long time ago, and I'll tell you why. For the most part, and we talked about this a little earlier, for the most part, I wasn't interested in any of this nerdy stuff until around 10 years ago when I had a spiritual shift, and I'm sure the listeners get tired of me talking about that, which led to being obsessed with books by psychics and mediums and looking for answers to questions like, what happens when we die? What exactly does the other side look like? Do spirits reach out to communicate to us? And can we communicate with them? And this is what you do. You've basically answered all of those questions for me already, right?
Well, I try to answer them for myself, and when I discovered that they were answerable, I began to write the books because everyone should know this stuff. It should be basic that everyone knows it.
In the back of your book, The Fun of Dying, you include a massive list of suggestions for further reading, and that led me to Our Unseen Guest by Darby and Joan, which I'm reading now. I'm about halfway through.
I love that. Yes.
But you must have done absolutely nothing but read for several years because you reference a lot of great books.
Well, what happened was that because I had unusual experiences as a child, I was trying to understand my experiences. And then in 1975, Dr. Raymond Moody published his wonderful Life After Life. That's where he coined the term near-death experiences. But he started a flood of interest, very early interest in this generation, in death and the afterlife. And there started to be a lot of books. So by the early 80s, I was doing what you went through a few years ago. I was reading as much as it was my entire hobby. I'm an attorney. I still practice law. So I have a day job and I've got kids and grandkids, and a husband of 44 years. But every waking minute that I was not doing something with or for my clients or my family, I was reading. And you know just how addictive that is because each book has a bibliography and they lead you to other books which have bibliographies. And that's how I was able to pull it all together because eventually I learned that late 19th and early 20th century, first 20 or 30 years of it, Darby and Joan are part of that period. We had some wonderful channeled material and stuff that came through deep trance mediums and hundreds of communications from people in southern England and the United States, eastern part mostly. And it all was so consistent. They all had been to the same place, different experiences. It's a big, complex place, but that's when I knew this was real. So by the mid-'80s, I knew it was real. And then from then on, I was just trying to figure it out.
Well, and you, the 70s and early 80s, wasn't there kind of another boom in this, genre of writing?
Yes, that's what first made me know it was possible to understand what actually is going on, because we know something is there. Everyone has encountered enough strange stuff to know that there's some bigger reality we're missing, and it's possible. I've discovered really to figure out most of it with a few little caveats. Most of our eternal mind is not accessible to us while we're in bodies. It's sort of like we're coming to the gym to have an Earth lifetime, and we strip down to our gym clothes, which is a very reduced subset of our great eternal mind. And so with that sort of limited mind, it's hard for us to wrap our minds around some of the larger concepts. But we can pretty much approximate doing that. And when you know that the answers are all there and they're accessible, it's just impossible not to keep trying to find them.
Well, I have so many questions for you, but I think it's like I said, I don't know where to go next, but I think it's important for my listeners to know how it all began for you. And you mentioned this briefly a few seconds ago, but you had some wild, as you said, experiences as a child. Just tell us about that first.
In April of 1955, I was 8 years old, and I woke up in the middle of the night, and I think it was probably about 4 a.m, actually, and I realized that there is no God. And I was terrified. Little Christian child, suddenly there's no God. And in the midst of my terror, I couldn't even move. I was so paralyzed with fear. In the midst of it, there was a flash of white light in my room, just a flash. And a young male voice said, "You wouldn't know what it is to have me unless you knew what it is to be without me. I will never leave you again." Now, of course, when you're 8, everything surprises you, so basically nothing does. My thought at the time was, I remember this vividly, oh, if you forget there's a God, they remind you, and I went back to sleep. But I never told anyone what had happened to me. I knew it was real. It was as real as anything that ever had happened, and I assumed it was normal, and I'd learn about it at some point. I even majored in early Christian history in college, just because I figured by the time you get to college, they'll tell you what happens when you forget there's a God and how they remind you. But I never asked a question, so I never got an answer. So then when I was 20, I came home from my summer job one evening feeling pretty glum, broad daylight, sitting up on my bed. The same thing happened over my right shoulder and splashing in the room, the same white light, and the same voice said, "I will never leave you." And there was even music with it this time. So that's what made me know, of course, it was real. What had happened to me when I was 8 was not my imagination. And that was when I decided I had to figure it all out. So it started for me when I was 20, and it was another 10 years before I began to even come across information that I could put together. But that's why. I mean, I had to find out what had happened to me, and it led me to all of this.
That is amazing. Some of us, try so hard in adulthood to get experiences like that. And you were just handed that at 8. That's cool.
Yes. But see, now I know why. I mean, before I came into this lifetime, I made a deal with my primary guide that I was going to write a book, which he had wanted to write and actually had written but had not published during one of his lifetimes. And he has guided me through my whole life to have the experiences. And that was his voice, of course, that I heard. And he has guided me to have these experiences and to write these books. Basically, I'm sort of like his avatar. I thought I had a separate life, but I really don't. And I'm perfectly content with that now. But some of us do this. Some of us have made deals with our primary guides or with others that we're going to do certain things. And my primary guide is someone whose name, should I say who he is?
I was going to say a few people might know him.
Yes, they might have heard of him. In his next to last lifetime, he was Thomas Jefferson, which explains why I was obsessed with Thomas Jefferson as a child. Mm-hmm. I've always been interested in him. So when I learned just 2 years ago that he was the one behind all of this, it didn't surprise me as much as perhaps it should have. But I just wrote a blog post about reincarnation, and that's something people might want to check out because reincarnation is a complex thing, and I don't like it, so therefore I haven't researched it as much as I might. But coming to know a reincarnated being about whom there's information. Well, he's not reincarnated; he's now beyond incarnating. But I know somebody, but I also know one of his lifetimes pretty well, and it's interesting to see how he's the same, but he's also a different person. He has very little interest in that lifetime. You or I would care, but he doesn't care. Mm-hmm. He's gone to something else altogether now. He was very spiritual, and when he was an old man, he wrote a book about Jesus and about spirituality that he didn't publish because he said the time wasn't right. And of course, he would have, if this book had come out then, it probably would have destroyed his reputation. And that was something you don't want to do when you're old and famous. But that was why I came in, so I could write his book. And I did. And it was channeled, and it came out in on 75. I mean, what am I saying? 75. You see where I'm living now. I'm living in the past. It came out just 2 years ago, and it's called Liberating Jesus. So that I thought was the end of it, but it turns out not to be. It was just the beginning, and he's sort of driving my train completely now.
I didn't realize that you had 2 books channeled through him. How does that work? How does the information come out?
Can I tell you something humiliating?
Do, please.
Everything I've ever written, I now realize has been channeled.
Ah.
I have tried to write independently. I've gotten an idea or someone has really given me an idea and I've tried to write it. I can't write a word. But everything I've written has come from Thomas's team. And it's all been part of his big project. So I just go along with it. I'm sort of like, I feel bad for him that he's reduced at this point to dealing through me, of all people. But I'm doing my very best for him. He knows that.
So I guess it's similar to the inspiration people talk about with like musicians and savants and stuff like that.
Yes. That my muse led me to do this or that, or I had this idea and it came to me, and as you say, with music, I sat down at the piano and I typed it all out and wrote it out, and I just, please, people, that's not from you. That's from your guides. We all have guides. And if part of what we have signed up to do is write music or write books or teach or do something that our guides want to have done, we signed up for the deal. We said, yeah, I'll come and do it. Roger, we saluted and we got into a body. But it's not from us. And it's humbling, but it's freeing in a way. I don't think he's going to let me make a mistake. So even though some of what I'm writing now is very daring, I think it's what he wants.
You said something a few minutes ago about how you don't like reincarnation. What's that about?
Well, I was as you can imagine, when I was a child, a young adult, I was very Christian. I was extremely Christian, the most Christian person you've ever known, until I was in my early 50s. And that's one of the things Christians don't believe in. But what happened to me was that I've been doing all this work. And while I'm doing it, I'm also reading the Bible. I read the Bible cover to cover 6 or 8 times, and the New Testament twice as many times. So I was really familiar with the Bible, and I was trying so hard in all my research to find anything that suggested to me that what I had believed as a Christian, or still then believed, was true. And I finally, in my early 50s, had to accept the fact that absolutely none of it was true. And that was very hard. I'll have to tell you, I put away my Bible for a couple of years and I stopped going to church, but it was really a crisis of the soul because, could you go to hell for having discovered there is no hell? I mean, this is a sort of conundrum I was wrestling with back then. And finally, one day, I decided even though I didn't want to test the Lord, I had to get rid of what was going on in my mind around and around. And I thought he had said a lot of this stuff. So I picked up my Gospels and I read just the Gospels. I didn't read the rest of the Bible with it, which is most Christians think it's all one mush. It's not. The Gospels are genuine. Jesus tells us things in the Gospels about God, reality, death, the afterlife, and the meaning and purpose of our lives that we could not have verified in any manner until the early 20th century. It's incredible and amazing and beautiful, and it was the most astonishing and wonderful moment of my life. And everything I've done since then has been to try to help people understand that Jesus is not a religious figure. Jesus came to us from God as our teacher, and it's time we listen to him, which Christians do not do.
Well, you are a master at writing appendices in your books, and you were just talking about, the Gospels. And at the end, when I got to the end of The Fun of Dying, it even inspired a big Facebook post of mine because I was listening to Jesus, where you talk about that. And as a person who has kind of been running away from a Southern Baptist, teaching growing up, it was like mind blowing to me, and it was so comforting to read that. And I posted it on Facebook and was like, oh my gosh, guys, read this. Where does the dogma come from?
It comes mainly from Paul, and it comes from the Old Testament too. The problem is this. Those who were alive when Jesus was teaching were first century primitive people, like late Iron Age. I mean, they knew nothing from nothing. And they had all these beliefs that were, a little bit rightish, but they really weren't about the genuine God or the genuine reality. They couldn't have. In what other parts of our lives do we still take what people believed 2,000 years ago as, quote, gospel? No other area. And God certainly deserves more consideration than anything else. So why aren't we listening to God now? Instead, we've said, well, you said your last word 2,000 years ago. Now we're just going to, keep stuffing it down your throat. He told us not to do this. He said, no one puts a patch of unshrunk cloth on an old garment, for the patch pulls away from the garment and a worse tear results. Nor do people put new wine into old wineskins. Otherwise, the wineskins burst and the wine pours. I had this in front of me so I can read it. And the wine pours out and the wineskins are ruined. But they put new wine into fresh wineskins, and both are preserved. That is Matthew 9:16-17. There was not a single Christian who understands what he meant. What he meant was, don't package what I'm teaching you with the Old Testament. He says in another place, love the Lord your God with all your heart, soul, and mind, and love your neighbor as yourself. And that Christians do pay attention to, but they ignore the next line. On these two commandments, two, depend the whole law and the prophets, Matthew 22:37-40. Well, the law and the prophets was what we call the Old Testament. He said, you can take that whole law and the prophets and put it way over there and ignore it, because it all comes down to loving God and loving your fellow man. And that's it. That's what he came to teach us. But there is not a Christian, not a professed Christian, and certainly not a Southern Baptist Christian, who would get that. And why? I mean, if you claim to love Jesus, for heaven's sake, the first thing you should try to do is understand what he came to say. But understand Paul's problem, and I don't blame him. I'm grateful to him. He preserved the teachings of Jesus for us. Mm-hmm. His problem was that Jesus's death, which I'm told by Thomas, was not even supposed to happen. It was something Jesus decided to do at the last minute almost, because he had no other way to convince people that they were eternal beings than to rise from the dead. So he did. Ta-da! That's what it was meant to do. But that death so demoralized the followers of the way, which is what Jesus called his teachings, the way. It so demoralized them that Paul had to do something. And what he did was to package those teachings in first century Judaism. What we have to this day and call Christianity is a first century Jewish sect. And that's good, but it's the wrapping. For 2,000 years, we've been enjoying the wrapping. We have not opened the gift. It's time to open the gift now. And that the gift is those gospel teaching. Sorry to be a preacher, but you got me started, Patrick, and I can't stop once I get started.
No, I love that. It's, I am sometimes very conflicted with, what I've was taught growing up and being a good person and what's true and what's not. And sometimes in this community, as a paranerd, we call ourselves in my community, we're very often judged, or people want to, they want to save us or think we need some Jesus, and it's kind of, it's comforting to hear that. Do you know what I'm trying to say?
Yes, I do. And think about this. We know that God is infinite love. Even Christians believe that, right? Mm-hmm. Everybody who's a parent, ask yourself, which of your own particular children would you most enjoy being horribly murdered in front of your face just so you could forgive the others for messing up the living room? That's the core of Christian teaching. Jesus came to save us from God's anger. In fact, God never shows anger. The God of the Old Testament is not the genuine God. The genuine God is the God that Jesus came to tell us about. He came to say to those first century Jews, you got it partly right. We do have one God. But here is what God is. God is infinitely loving spirit. And he had to speak very simply for two reasons. One was because he was talking to these primitive people, but the other was that to talk against the prevailing religion when he was teaching was an immediate death sentence. Mm. And eventually he was killed. But first, he wanted to impart to them these truths. So he used several devices. One of them was parables, and another was he would give people truths over several days of time, because the temple guards who were always listening would change, but the people his followers he would hoped would remember the things he had said and put them together. And if you understand the constraints under which he operated, it's easy to see what he was trying to teach us. God is loving spirit. God is infinite love. God loves you in particular more than you can possibly imagine. And there's no earthly way you would need to be saved. There is no evidence, and I've looked hard for it, that anybody ever has had a post-death effect from the death of Jesus. Jesus has never saved a single human being because it was never necessary for him to save a single human being. God does not judge us. No religious figure judges us. The actual judgment is by ourselves, and Jesus even hints at that. In the way that you judge, you will be judged. With the measure you use, it'll be meted out to you, and that's true, but it's by yourself that will happen.
You've said that learning to forgive is very important. Why is that?
Because, and I'm not the one who says it, Jesus says it, because love is the reason we're here. Learning to love more perfectly is really the basic reason we're all here. Some of us have little extra duties like I do, but many people, that's why we're here. And all the terrible things that happen are lessons in love. But because of our human nature, because of the fact that we forget who we are while we're here, this limited little shell, people will hold grudges, will be angry, and all of those negative feelings get in the way of love. So until you have learned to forgive perfectly, you really, really can't love. The third fun book is called The Fun of Growing Forever. We can't transform the world until we transform ourselves. And it literally is just a handbook for using what Jesus taught us to basically ace this lifetime. I mean, you can make this your last lifetime. All you have to do is do exactly what Jesus taught us to do. And it's not even hard. It's easy and it's fun. But until we forgive, we can't love. It's that simple. Not at all.
Many of us in this community and many of the listeners of this show like to experiment with a lot of spirit communication tools. And I also famously fail at many of them.
Yes.
Meaning most of the time I get no communication. Sometimes I do. Yeah. Most of the time I don't. And I want to ask you a question, which is actually the name of a chapter out of one of your books. And that is, why is communication between the dead and the living so difficult?
Well, we have to understand how reality is constructed. There is no solid reality at all. What you see around you is entirely empty space, which is all energy. That's all it is. And so it's a great illusion, but it's an illusion. And reality is, how can I put this simply? Reality is all consciousness. Consciousness exists in a range of vibrations from lowest, which is abject fear, to highest, which is perfect love, which is, of course, the Godhead. And in that range, we, at this level of reality, have lowered our personal vibrations to be able to be at the material level, which we think may be the lowest level, we're not sure, of the consciousness-created reality that exists. And above us, but in the same place, think of your TV set. Your mind is a TV set. So right now it's tuned to that body on this level of reality. When you die, all that happens is your mind tunes to a slightly higher channel and you pick up a whole new solid reality just as if it were a TV set. It's really that simple. But what happens though is that we on this level are trying to communicate with a slightly higher channel. And that channel it's sort of like your Channel 5, I think I use this analogy in the book. Your Channel 5 newsman and your Channel 7 newsman want to share information, but they don't have a cell phone. How are they going to do it? They're both live and on air. They can't do it, right? It's not possible. Well, that's the same problem that we have when we try to communicate with the dead. Now, they can communicate with us much more easily because it turns out our minds can lower their vibrations easily, but it's hard to go higher than that to which your spiritual development is suited. So they lower their spiritual vibrations. They're around us all the time. But because we can't raise our vibrations, it's very hard to see them or to communicate with them. I don't understand why sometimes it's possible and sometimes it isn't. It has to do probably with aspects of consciousness physics that we don't yet understand. But keep in mind the fact that, people on different channels of your TV set can't communicate. And what we're trying to do, and what the dead are trying desperately now to do, is to bridge that gap. One thing that's going on is that they have begun to establish, the dead have begun to establish communication stations high enough in the Summerland that the negative entities that exist at the lowest part of reality, right above the Earth, say, level of reality, those entities are establishing solid stations there, which are going to, they say they're laying fiber optic cable. I mean, obviously that's an analogy, but they're trying to establish solid connections, sort of like between, the East Coast and the West Coast 150 years ago. They're trying to lay that line so that it will be easy for anybody with an app on their phone to talk to Aunt Mildred, who died 50 years ago. They're working on that now. It's actually in beta, but it's not going to be available until a lot more people have helped the dead to make it happen. Anybody who's interested, by the way, in doing this, R. Craig Hogan is leading the group for the North American station, which is going to be the biggest station, and it's in English. The only one that's working really well now is in Portuguese, which is a little bit hard for English people to get. But R. Craig Hogan, how can we? I don't remember his address for this, but I'll try to find it. But one way that you can do it is to go to information@afterlifeinstitute.org. That's information@afterlifeinstitute, one word, .org. And that should be an email to him, and just say, hey, I want to help work with the North American station, and he'll tell you how. And there are people getting phenomenal results. There are parents talking to their dead children right now through the North American station.
And this is when I get really nerdy, because I remember the first time I heard about these stations was reading Sarah Estep's book. And I know you know Sarah Estep. Uh-huh. And that is just, it blows my mind. And I think that is so cool.
Yeah. And it's really an effort by the dead. There is a difference now. Up until probably around the start of the 20th century, it was really handy that we didn't have any idea what was going on. We weren't getting communications from the dead, and it was good. We came here. It was a tough school. We grew spiritually when we went back. But the problem is that part of this stripped down part of our mind that we take with us is free will. If you don't have free will to choose to do what's right, you can't choose to do what's wrong. You don't learn a blessed thing. So we've got free will, and too many people in too many places on the earth have chosen wrong over the last, I don't know, I don't understand the whole story, but we're told that by the early part of the 20th century, those who are in charge of the earth had become very worried about how negative, how low the vibration had become among the people of the earth. It's a problem. So by the middle of the century, they were already sending people in to help to raise the spirit, the consciousness vibration of the planet. But then came the Second World War, and we exploded atomic bombs. And that was big, disastrous news in the very highest levels of reality, because we had basically lost our minds. So at that point, many people started to come in to work on this. I'm sure you're part of it. I was born 1 year after they exploded those bombs. Thomas said, get in there, for Pete's sake, we got to get this going. So that's where we are right now. We are pretty far into a process which is meant to result in the elevation of the consciousness of the planet. Jesus told us 2,000 years ago that if enough people would follow his teachings, we would bring the kingdom of God on earth. We pray for it. Thy kingdom come, thy will be done on earth as it is in heaven. He taught us to pray for it, and he taught us how to do it. And again, Christians have no clue. They ignore him altogether. But what I've been told now by Thomas is that it's become very serious. And this is the reason he wanted this book, Liberating Jesus, out so quickly, and The Fun of Growing Forever after it. If enough of us don't begin to do this fairly quickly, we are at the start of a very severe decline in the level of our civilization. and perhaps the extinction of it. And then the big thing they're worried about, believe it or not, and this you will identify with having been a Southern Baptist, is that in 200 years, and they can't predict the future because we have free will, but they can sort of game it much better than we can. And what they foresee is that in 200 years, what Tom calls the so-called Christians are going to start Armageddon on their own. And that's what they're trying to avoid at this point. They're trying to avoid a religious war 200 years from now.
Wow.
Isn't that awful? Think about it.
Ugh.
And the tragedy is that what would a war do? It would raise the fear on this planet. It would lower the consciousness vibration dramatically. That's why we know. They tell us Jesus is already here. He's not coming back on a white horse with a sword. He's already here. It's just that no one's paying attention to him. And if a war like that were started, it would be the end. It would finish the world. So we just have to work together to prevent that. And how do we do that? Easy. We try first to get rid of the fear in ourselves, which is why I think it's so important that everybody learn what goes on at death and what comes after death, and the fact that our minds are eternal. You are an eternal being. You never started, you never ended. Eternal, not immortal, but eternal. And people need to learn that, and then they won't be afraid. And then we've got to learn how to forgive and how to love, just as Jesus said. And he said, it won't take many, and we'll be able to bring the kingdom of God on earth. And that's what the raising of the consciousness of the planet is trying to do. So do you see that it's all one thing? Jesus is part of your movement. He always was. It's just that nobody has paid any attention to that.
Is it important for people to stumble on these truths that you write about and when the time is right for them, or are you on a mission to reach people to help them wake up?
I'm on a mission to help as many people, because fear is the base fear. When you no longer fear death, you really no longer fear anything. And getting rid of fear is how we raise the consciousness of the planet. When people are making only loving choices, not fearful choices, we will have the kingdom of God on earth. And because our minds are all part of the eternal mind that is all that exists, that one consciousness, our minds are all part of the same consciousness. Even as few as 10% of us will take the teachings of Jesus and of other great teachers, but I think the teachings of Jesus are the easiest to follow and the ones probably most familiar to Westerners. If even as few as 10% of us will do that, we ourselves can raise the consciousness of the planet. We're all part of one being. So how do you get rid of ISIS? Not by fighting, by ourselves perfecting ourselves. Once we do that, they'll just notice they don't want to fight anymore, because they can't continue to be alive and be part of the consciousness of God and not be affected by what you and I do. So there's a lot of hope in this, and it's not going to be hard, but it just requires helping enough people understand the importance of raising our own consciousness vibrations, loving, and it's fun. It's fun. It's the most fun you've ever had, just let me say. And loving everybody is much, much more joyous than just picking a few people and hating everybody else. It's the best.
So I have I've never asked a guest this question, but I think you might be a good person to ask this. I and some of my loved ones have made a sort of pact for how we'll communicate after we pass on. For example, my immediate family and my partner know that they'll need to pay close attention to their bedside tables, because my plan is to do something in that area that lets them know that I'm still here and able to communicate. But I have to be honest, because some mediums and spiritual teachers and books that I've read, have me worried that when the time comes for me to die, it'll be, dangerous for me to hang back, that I shouldn't be concerned with the living at that point. I should move on out of fear that I'll miss my only opportunity to walk into that light. Is it weird to have anxiety over that?
Yeah, well, only because they've given you some unnecessary confusion. When you die, what happens is, and it's a joyous feeling. Some of the dead say it's almost an orgasmic feeling. You leave the boat anchor that was your body, and suddenly you're light and free and happy and floating in the air, and you feel immensely powerful because you're beginning to feel again your greater mind. So that's a very dangerous time because the people around your bed are wailing and feeling for your pulse, because once the silver cord, what the Bible calls a silver cord, it's like it looks almost silver, and it's just a cord that has attached you to your body your whole life. Mm-hmm. Once it frays and breaks, then that body is dead, and there's nothing to do to revive it. And so you're going to want to reassure your loved ones, and that's the worst thing you can do because you've already begun to raise your vibration, but you'll start to lower it just by paying attention to them. We all have visitors at our deathbeds, people who've died ahead of us, that our parents, our pet dog, whoever we're most likely to trust and to follow. And their job is, once we're out of our body, to get us to follow them and not to pay attention to the rest of the people in the room who still have bodies. Big tip. Follow the people who came to get them. Big tip. Because we aren't sure about the process, but what seems to be the case is that if you lower your vibration enough and you can't perceive them anymore, you're basically going to be stuck outside of time in that spot. And there are enough examples of people we have discovered for whom this has happened that I just wouldn't take chances. Go with them. What happens is they will take you in the same place at a slightly higher level. They'll take you to that new channel. You'll get acclimated. You'll be happy, but you'll be very aware of the emotions and what's going on with the people you love. And that is when you're able to go back and help them. You've completed your own transition. You are safely there, and you have a much expanded mind, and it's just much easier. There also are experts there who will teach you how to communicate with the living very effectively. Mikey Morgan, who is a sixth level being, very advanced being, and had last lived in the 1600s, came back and lived a 20-year lifetime that ended in 2007. And his book, Flying High in Spirit, which I helped his mother to publish, is the best book. Anybody interested in how a young person, what is it? Flying High in Spirit, a young snowboarder's account of his ride through heaven. While he was here, Mikey learned to snowboard. To this day, he snowboards. And in fact, he showed up at a meeting I was having with Thomas not long ago. I always have to do this through a medium. And she said, "Oh my goodness, he looks like he's on a skateboard." I said, "No, he's on a snowboard." She said, "Oh yeah, he just said, how come there's no snow in this room?" So Mikey has a sense of humor. But what Mikey does, one of the things he especially enjoys doing, is teaching people who have just arrived how to communicate with their families. And a lot of the signs that happen right after a person has died are done by people like Mikey, helping your dead loved ones to give you the rainbow that you see when you leave the funeral service, or the cloud of butterflies around you, or whatever it is that's a dramatic sign. It's all wonderful. It's all positive. It's all good. That's what people have to know. Christianity is based in fear of a judgmental and angry God. There is no such thing. No such thing. The genuine God is nothing but perfect love, and especially perfect love for you in particular. People have to know that. And once they know that, really the whole world changes.
It's funny, as simple as it is, I never really thought of it in terms of lowering my vibration in a time when it's doing anything but, So crossover, get there first.
Get there.
And then learn how to communicate later.
Yes, and you can be doing it within hours. It all depends on how important it is to you. But if your own particular loved ones haven't started doing it, then don't worry about that either. There's a lot more to do there than here, and it's a lot more fun there, and people aren't prepared for that. So some people go a little crazy in the beginning with the fun part. But it's not uncommon for people who have literally just left their bodies to appear at deathbeds. It can happen really quickly, to appear to the living. Typically, they'll stand at the end of the bed, or they'll appear beside you as you drive in a car, and they'll say, "I'm fine," and then they'll disappear. There's a great story involving my dear friend, and Jefferson and John Adams both died on the 4th of July, 1826, 50 years to the day after the Declaration of Independence was theoretically signed. It was signed a few times, but Jefferson died in the morning in Virginia, and Adams died in the afternoon in Massachusetts. And there was, of course, no quick communication. Nobody knew Jefferson had died. And so Adams was almost dead. He was moribund, and he stirred, and he hadn't talked in a long time. He said, Thomas Jefferson still survives. And soon after he died. Now, at the time, that made no sense.
Right.
But it makes sense when you realize Jefferson had already died, zooped to heaven, zooped back down to his friend and said, here I am, everything's going to be fine. Isn't that amazing? Isn't that neat?
That is amazing. I want to know, what are your opinions about evil or a darker side of the spirit world? Is it all just free will stuff, or is it something bigger?
That's a great question. There is a lot of evil. It appears to all be human created. The lower vibration an entity is, the weaker it is. The weakest entities of which we're aware are called shadow men. They sort of lurk in closets and try to scare us, believe it or not. Isn't that pathetic? Because they feed off negative energy. Otherwise, they have no ability at all. But they can't hurt us. All they can do is scare us. Now, I'm not saying you can't be hurt by evil entities. There are people who have driven themselves crazy by worshiping Satan, which doesn't exist, or the devil, which doesn't exist, or whatever. But just keep remembering, love is the power, and it's the only power. The higher the vibration, the more power there is. At the highest vibration, the power is infinite. And the lower vibration is, the weaker it is. So you can choose evil. You have the power to do that. But if you do that, you only weaken yourself and you go in the wrong direction. And there's no satisfaction there. There's no powerful entity in opposition to God. It is impossible, because a powerful negative entity would be very weak. So it would be pathetic in a puddle on the floor. Does that answer your question?
That does answer my question. And it feels good.
Yeah, doesn't it feel good? Nothing can harm us. We are infinite, powerful beings which are part of the eternal mind of God. There's nothing that can harm us. Only we can harm us. We have the power to scare ourselves so much that we could make ourselves insane. But there's no point in doing that. Going the other way is just so much more fun.
Do you remember the first book you read from, this whole genre, this spiritual world?
I don't at this point, because I started trying even in college, and it was pathetic. All I could find were ghost story books, and I don't remember them anymore. We came across them when we were cleaning up my mother's house, 5 or 6 of these ghost story books that I knew were from my college bookshelf. But it wasn't really until after Raymond Moody's book that I began to find books that led me to the scholarly stuff. And, to the people who had compiled the communications in the early part of the 20th century and the real researchers back then. I mean, I wasn't necessarily clued into anything, so I didn't know where to look until that happened. And then there was a flood. I don't even remember what I read first. It was like I was at the biggest feast for a decade reading all that stuff. It was the best.
By the way, random thought, but I am totally convinced that one of these days I'm going to turn a closet in my house into a psychomantium and try to get Raymond to teach me how to do that.
Well, that's very brave of you. Yeah, do your people know what a psychomantium is?
We've talked about it a few times, and I've mentioned Moody's work a few times, but I imagine a lot of them would have to kind of go back or Google that.
Yeah. And then there's scrying, there's dark mirror gazing and gazing into pools of blood and all of that stuff. There have been techniques used over the ages to communicate with the dead that we are still aware of. It's just that in our age, if you can't talk to them on the phone, they're not real. And that's one of the problems mediums have. There are some really crappy mediums, but there are some excellent mediums. And it's still, people are suspicious of it. They've got to hear that voice. And when they hear that, and the familiar voice saying familiar things, and it's coming through a call they made, then people will start to believe it. I don't think anything else will convince them.
I keep thinking of more questions. Are there any tools, like spirit communication tools, that you use? I know some people are a fan of those and some people don't need them. And do you use it like Ouija or,
No.
anything?
No, in fact, the only way I communicate with my guides is through Suzanne Wilson, who I think is the best living spiritual medium. And I've sent her so many people that she no longer takes new clients. I'm sorry about that, because she is to mediums like, Caruso would be to singers. She is the best, because when she is able to get from our dead such rich detail, so much confirmation that there's just no possible way it couldn't be real. But she's especially good in helping me communicate with Thomas. And he now we do it every 2 months, just so he can make sure I'm still on track. And with I have other guides who do other things. I write fiction, and I have a whole set of fiction guides that I love because I'm having fun with the fiction, and they're making it possible, because I can't write fiction without them either. I now accept that. It's okay. I mean, there are things you can do. If you're electronically inclined, I would get on the train of the North American station, because I think that's going to actually work. If you're inclined to want to learn to communicate, Mikey Morgan's mother communicates with him by pendulum, and that turns out to be a very good way for people who have motivated guides or loved ones to communicate with you if you don't have much in the way of psychic ability. So I would learn how to use a pendulum probably before anything else. But if you're like me, you got to find a good medium, because I don't have the patience to learn any of that stuff. You just don't. We accept our shortcomings eventually, and I don't have the patience.
I very much can relate to that. Well, you have amazing energy, and so I want to thank you for that. This has been such an awesome conversation, and I want to give you the opportunity to we'll put links in the show notes, tell people where to find you, maybe work that's coming up for you, projects, and maybe how to contact you, because I know that people do, and you're very open to that.
Well, my website is robertagrimes.com, and there you can read my blog and find, as you say, I do a live radio show on bbmglobalnetwork.com, but they turn that then into broadcasts on 2 other networks, and also on webtalkradio.net. It's available a week and a half later as a podcast, and on iTunes. So anybody who is interested in hearing me can easily find me. Just go to the radio tab on robertagrimes.com. Periodically, I do appear in various places. I try to remember to get those listed on my Facebook professional page, but I don't do it myself. Someone else does it, and I often don't get it there. But I will for sure be at the Afterlife Research and Education Symposium, September 15 to 17 of 2017 in Scottsdale, Arizona. And again, information at afterlifestudies.org, 800-690-4232. They even give out their phone number. But this is going to be a fantastic symposium. The 3 things we're going to concentrate on this year are afterlife communication and cutting edge stuff. Also, we're going to concentrate on death and how to make it easier and happier for people. That's a whole new science that's starting. And finally, I'm going to be talking about the meaning and purpose of life. And that's what we've decided to call it, is the new spirituality. It's not Christianity, but it's based on what the dead are teaching us, and it's exactly what Jesus taught us. So we're beginning to talk about it now. We'll be talking about that at the symposium. And we would love to have as many people as possible be there. We expect 300 to 400 people, but let's bust the doors. One of the people who will be there is George Nouri of Coast to Coast. Mm-hmm. We've had him before at our workshops and symposiums, and he is just the most delightful, entertaining guy you'll ever meet. And so that's the main thing I'm going to be doing in 2017, plus, random things here and there.
Roberta Grimes, you rock.
It's so good to meet you, Patrick, finally.
For show notes, including links to anything we may have mentioned in this episode, visit bigseance.com. Just click on the Big Seance podcast logo or find it in the menu. You can also find and subscribe to the show in iTunes, Stitcher, Google Play Music, TuneIn Radio, and iHeartRadio. Do you have any comments or feedback? Go to bigseance.com/feedback to learn how to get your voice in a future show.
Or you can call my feedback line, 7755-TELL-ME. That's 775-583-5563. Interested in learning how to promote and share the podcast? Go to bigseance.com/share. Thank you so much for listening. Unfortunately, it's time to blow the candles out, but we'll see you and light them again next time.